Okay, in that case, we'll move on to the next talk. Dr. Bridget Ann Kirwan is a member of an organization called SOCOR out of Switzerland. Her group is instrumental in organization and carrying out of multiple international trials. And we've brought her under the wing, or asked her help really, in order to help us with the Interact project. And I've never done an international registry before. So when we looked for people, Dr. Michael Farku of our hospital, who's our epidemiologist and cardiologist in terms of international trials, recommended Dr. Kirwan as the most foremost international expert in this. And she's going to help us to understand what the challenges in the development of organization of an international registry are. On a personal note, she lives in Switzerland and has a strong constitution. She goes swimming every day, summer or winter, as long as the water is not frozen. So she's a very, very interesting person over and above the epidemiology that she's going to talk to us about. So Dr. Kirwan, go ahead.
I'm talking to myself. Thank you very much for that really great introduction. In fact, I'm blushing. Yes, maybe I just add, in fact, I will get my pickaxe out to break the ice in the water if it is frozen. It hasn't happened yet in Lake Geneva. It's now at what is it, about 5 degrees, I think. So it's still doable in its current state. So I've been asked to present to you the challenges in the development and organization of an international registry. And as Dr. Kushner said, that I'm involved with the Interact team, part of the steering committee, to get this great registry underway. Now, I've got 30 minutes to go through the issue about the challenges. So I'll really be the tip of the iceberg. And as we're going to be, then we'll have time for questions at the end of 15 minutes. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. And this is what I plan to focus on. So cancer registry, of course, the purpose of registry is how to go about setting up a registry. The potential challenges, with the good news is that the majority of these can be overcome and or mitigated. And then at the end, we've got time for some questions and answers. So let's go to the definition of what actually is a patient registry. And this is just one of the definitions. So patient registries have been defined as an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data, that it be clinical or other, to evaluate specific outcomes for a population defined by a particular disease, condition or exposure, and that serves as a predetermined scientific, clinical, or policy purpose. However, there's no consistent term as such of the term patient registry, and it's often used synonymously with clinical registry, clinical data registry, disease registry, outcome registry, and so on, to mention just a few. In setting up registries, they can be done at either a local, regional, national, or international level. But what is important that irrespective of how it's done, standardized data should be collected. And we'll come back to the importance of data collection later on. So why take the endeavor to do an international registry? Well, international registries do provide a really great opportunity to investigate the geographic variations which there are in disease etiology and the disease progression, in addition to treatment patterns and clinical effectiveness in the different populations, which otherwise you would not have access to if your registry is to be at either local, regional, or national level. In addition, the international registries give access to a wider and larger pool of participants. And that, of course, will enable you perhaps to identify, detect adverse events not previously reported, and also to better understand rare conditions. So in other words, we're looking at real-world evidence, which, for example, you can also include in registries patients who otherwise would not be included in the randomized clinical trials, because as we know, randomized clinical trials are certainly the golden standard to assess, evaluate new therapies, but often the sicker patients are excluded from these trials because of the stringent exclusion criteria. So the registries give a chance to evaluate these patients and to get information which otherwise would not be available for them or you would not have access to. However, there are unique challenges, if one could say that, because of variations in terms of the interpretation of the data, because of the variations in treatment patterns across the different geographical regions, the patient populations, the cultural differences that exist, and last but not least, the regulatory and ethical environments. So in order to successfully conduct an international registry, they need to be planned, they need to be designed in a very well manner and conducted taking into consideration the challenges mentioned under item 1. Now, when it comes to setting up a registry, I'll just briefly allude to 2 different models, one being the central registry and the other the registry network model. So in the central registry model, this is where the data is stored in one central database managed by one data coordinating center. And there's one protocol that governs the process. The same case report form, which is the document used to collect the data, will be used across all participating sites with perhaps potential of local variations depending on what is required or requested locally by regulatory to have or not have in the case report form. The registry network model is more individual registries, which may be done at either regional, national level, where there may be multiple protocols, there may be different CRFs, and the only thing that's unique to this type of model is that the same data dictionary is used. So what we are planning for the Interact registry will be the central registry, where the data will be stored in one central database managed by one data coordinating center. Just irrespective of the type of model that is used for registry, you have to think about also in setting up your data management to make sure that at the end that we have data that's accurate, that's complete, and that it's interpretable. So there's quite a number of activities that you will need to contemplate on getting into place in order to make sure that you end up with your data that is completely, I say, accurate, clean, and complete. We'll come back to the data collection aspect in the following slide. So in terms of then setting up a registry, what do you need to take into consideration and what are your potential challenges? Well, first and foremost, it's important to define what is the purpose of your registry. And then that being the case, then what registry model are you going to use? Which patient population, disease to be included and will be evaluated in your registry? This is important because you need to ensure that you're going to have the same population that's included throughout the different regions, because you want to end up with a homogeneous population, not with a very heterogeneous population. So before deciding on that, you need to do your literature research to be able to understand on a global basis if the population that you want to include is that will be in the other perhaps geographical regions where you intend to go to. And how are you going to ensure that these patients are included? Well, then you need to define and set up a protocol which is going to be commonly used throughout the different geographical regions where your registry is going to be done. Another issue that's very important is that you have to be able to ascertain how easy it will be to identify patients, because one big challenge in any registry, it goes the same for clinical trials, is the selection, identification and inclusion of patients. So to overcome this challenge, you really need to make sure that, first of all, the patient population that you want to include does exist. You want to be able to identify the prevalence in the different countries where you intend to go to. And to do this, you need to really have good contacts with the key opinion leaders in these respective countries in order to be able to provide the information, to make sure that the information that you're provided with is sufficiently accurate. Again, you'll have to ascertain how many patients you want to include in your registry to be able to have publications and data that's interpretable and meaningful. So again, looking at the feasibility of being able to recruit the number of patients that you will need to determine that. Again, this comes back to doing your homework, so to say, with respect to prevalence in the countries where you do want to go to the disease prevalence. Another thing also is to be able to understand the treatments, what treatments are being used, and is this relatively standardized in the different regions where you plan to do your registry. You will also want to recruit then a certain number of patients over a certain number of time and to follow these patients up for a certain number of time. So it'll be important to determine how many sites you will need to be included in your registry. What's the feasibility of how many sites can the registry manage? Is there a minimum, a maximum? And how are you going to identify your sites? That's really very, very important, because you want to have researchers involved in your registry who are motivated, who will include the patients within the timeframes that are defined, and also will include the patient population. So the patients with the disease that's under evaluation by the registry. So all of these are really challenges, yes, but if you have got the right people working with you in your registry, you can overcome these challenges. So geographical location is also a very important point, because you, as I've said a few moments ago, you have to be able to ascertain the disease epidemiology, local practices, and access to patients and treatments. So it's something that needs to be taken into consideration, defining where you plan to do your international registry. So data collection, again, we have to be cognizant that in clinical trials, for example, there's about 60, perhaps to 65% of data collected that's never used. So in defining what data needs to be collected, it's critical for each data point that you determine what are we going to do with this data. Because collecting data on the site level is a lot of work. You've got to determine how you're going to collect it. Perhaps in some countries you can extract data from an EHR. Other countries that's not possible, so sites will have to enter the data manually into an electronic system, the electronic case report form. But whatever the mode is, it's more defining what you will collect and having really a question for yourselves. Why are we collecting this data? What are we going to do with it? And how will this impact on what we want to publish, for example? Will this be of relevance for publication? Data sharing agreements is also something that you'd have to think about, which can be extremely challenging. But again, knowing that this is going to be could be a potential issue, it's important to address this up front. So you may need to go to your hospital before your registry ever gets underway to understand what data sharing agreements are. And also, will it be necessary to obtain informed consent from patients? Can a waiver be obtained for this, etc.? So all of this again is important to do there. Certainly it's a challenge, but knowing that this is an issue that has to be dealt with, it should be something that should be addressed at the time the registry is being thought about and set up. So in essence, it is important not to put the cart before the horse. And what I presented in the previous slide is not necessarily in the order with which things should be done. However, in the planning phase, it really should be done in a stepwise forward manner to ensure that it's everything that is put in place, which should be put in place in order for the next step to be done. So in addition to the data collection, defining what your data collection tools are going to be, data confidentiality is also a very important thing that you need to think about. So in Europe, we have this GDPR regulation that has to be complied with. In the US, it's HIPAA. In the other geographical regions, there are also local regulations that have to be complied with. So this is something in setting up your data collection tools that you ensure that none of these regulations are going to be, there won't be any breaches, and that data confidentiality can be assured at all times. This is really, it can be, it's not even just limited to registries or in clinical trials, this is also an issue. But knowing that this is something that's got to be dealt with, this can be mitigated, and you can put procedures and processes in place to make sure that their data confidentiality can be ensured throughout the life cycle of your registry. Local and regional regulatory ethics issues have to be also taken into consideration, because depending on the country and region, it may be required to get ethics approval, it may be required to get regulatory approval before you can do the registry. In some countries, this may not even be necessary. As I've mentioned previously, it may be necessary to obtain informed consent from patients, whereas in other countries, you may get a waiver for that. So again, it's a potential hurdle, yes, but this can be overcome by evaluating upfront and discussing with the experts in this area as to what exactly would be required to get the registry set up in each respective country. So we come to funding. Funding is also a critical issue because you're not going to start your registry if there's not sufficient funding to collect or to get the registry in place to be able to collection of the data and then its subsequent reporting. So it is important there's adequate funding to define and to identify your funding source, because it would be unethical as such to start with the registry, start collecting the data, and then ending up that there's not sufficient funding to enable the reporting and the publication of the data. So securing funding, and perhaps depending on the duration of your registry, it's important to make sure that as the registry progresses, perhaps then that new sources of funding could also be identified. So in order to overcome a lot of these challenges, it's really important that you've got core functions within your registry structure, and that being the steering committee, an executive committee, perhaps a publication committee, data coordinating center, and a group that will be responsible for the study oversight and management. And all of this is really important, like in any clinical trial, in fact, to ensure that your registry continues as planned insofar those patients are recruited, the patients that are recruited into your registry comply with the criteria for the patients to be included, that data collection is done in a timely time frame, etc. And that goes then also for data management, that the data cleaning is done on an ongoing basis. It's also important to ensure that your sites that are involved in your registry continue to include patients. So you need to contemplate and consider all the site motivation efforts that you would put in place to ensure that this is done. And there's multiple ways of doing this, increasing the awareness of your registry, and perhaps having a website, a blog, where the participating sites can actually have access to. And it's not just also for the site personnel and the sites themselves, but also for patients, because again, it's thanks to the patients that we will end up with the data also, so they also deserve some form of motivation. And it could be maybe setting up a website for patients that are participating in registry, where there's updates, where they can access publications and whatever else. So again, all of these things are important to keep the motivation going for your registry, and to ensure then that the site motivation to keep recruiting patients and also completing the case report forms is maintained throughout the life cycle of your registry. Last but not least, which is very important, is the publications. I mean, one of the main purposes of doing your registry is to collect data which you can actually publish your data that you're collecting. So having a publication plan, defining and identifying the authors of these publications, etc., is really very, very important. So perhaps, developing a publication plan, on a yearly basis, or something to that effect, is also something that's very motivating for sites and also for the researchers that are involved in your registry. So at the end, as we've just gone through, there are quite a number of challenges. However, with teamwork, these challenges, for the most part, can be overcome. So identifying the team members, let it be on a committee level, let it be with the sites and other partnerships. It's really important that this is done at the onset of setting up your registry. Also, some other issues that can help with that is identifying the key opinion leaders from each of the participating countries, because this is really crucial, and defining their role in motivating also the sites on a local level, because that in itself will also help to mitigate the impact of the different medical practices and treatments that may be also in the other countries, because normally registries are also going to occur over a long period of time. And I think it's important to keep in mind that over that time frame, treatment patterns and standards of care may change during the lifespan of the registry. Therefore, you do need to monitor this on a very frequent basis. And perhaps then this could result in changing the protocol, in changing the data to be collected, etc., in the trial. So working with key opinion leaders is really important on a national level to be able to identify this and to ensure that everybody is informed when there are key changes, so that then the protocols, etc., can be adapted and reflects the real world today, so to say, for the treatment patterns for the patient population under investigation. So I think for these challenges, as I've said, is that, clinical research and registries are no exception, is never without a roadblock. And what is most important is to plan, to prevent, and to be proactive. These are the 3 Ps, or something, I think, in setting up an international registry, which is really critical, and always should be in the back of one's mind from the onset, in fact, of designing your registry. So to conclude, so I think we've seen that registries do play a crucial role in the generation of evidence that can eventually drive healthcare. And this is one of the aims of doing registries, is to drive but also improve healthcare. And the challenges that the setup and running of an internal registry can be overcome on the proviso that a challenge is recognized as being a challenge and therefore action can be taken. There's no point in if an issue comes up, to put it under the carpet and pray and hope that it'll go away. It's a question of really taking action, identifying what the issue is, taking action to resolve it and or to mitigate that it occurs again in the future. Important that you have the necessary experts that are involved in your registry to support the design, data collection, analysis, and reporting. I think we've discussed the reasons why this is really crucial. To evaluate upfront ethical and regulatory considerations and requirements. We've also discussed why this is important, because if this is only discovered when we're 3/4 way into the trial that things are being done which are not ethical or regulatory compliant, that of course can end up with a large number of problems. So is to be able to understand and to know what is required to be able to put that in place before the trial gets underway. In order to successfully execute the trial and the data collection, it's important to have the well-designed technology that is defined up front, that the data collection tools in particular are state-of-the-art to ensure that your data collection will be done without any hitches also. Again, just in order to avoid and to mitigate challenges, be careful not to bite off more than you can chew, meaning not to go further afield if that's not necessary. Perhaps to start off your registry with a reduced number of sites and geographical locations to make sure that what is planned works, and then to spread your wings a bit wider and to spread the net. So to do things in a step-by-step process. as I've said earlier, is that recruitment, with respect to recruitment, encouragement and gratitude for participation for the sites and the patients should also be thought about. And also important to nurture collaborative relationships with the researchers, because without the researchers, we don't have the patients. Without the patients, we don't have the data. So these groups are also critical for the success of your registry. Important also to establish a motivated and dedicated team, being the steering committee, the country leads, the data management group, the coordination groups, etc. And all of this, so that in fact it comes down to one great team of multidisciplinary people who are going to lead and bring your registry to a successful end. Throughout the registry also, it's important to think about the partnerships with a broad range of stakeholders. And this is also important for perhaps increasing the awareness of your registry. And perhaps it could also attract additional funding, which is necessary for your registry, etc. Publications, as we said, that's what's really critical for registries, is to have regular and frequent publications. That also is a way of increasing the awareness of your of the registry of what's being done. And also, of course, the data that comes out of it may well be very important when it comes to patient care and perhaps improving the quality of care for the patient population under investigation. So the last word I have to say, that registries will certainly pave the way for high quality research that will eventually drive the local and national, even international policy to improve patient care. And that's what our research is all about. And as Winston Churchill has said, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. So thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to replying to any questions that anybody may have.
That was an amazing talk. Thank you very much. I'm going through that, I'm going, okay, good. I'm glad I have Bridget doing this. Okay, I'm glad I have Usama doing that, and friends from around the world doing that. And it's so important to have experts that know way more than you do helping you along. And that's really important in terms of planning, as you've said. I think it's really important. Whenever we have a steering committee, this is a world global initiative, and it's easy for somebody who has to organize one country, but when you have to organize a whole continent with different requirements, as you said, is very, 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 very different stories. So it's something that requires a lot of planning. We already have one group from Italy who wants to join the Interact group, even though we are still in the planning stage, and that's great that the word has gotten out. If you look at the previous tumor conferences for the past 2 years, you'll be able to get an introduction to the concept of the International Tumor Registry, and you'll be able to see that. But through the previous sessions, we've already had people coming forward and asking to join. So that's really good. But as you've said, it's important to plan really, really carefully beforehand. We have a question by Dr. Rogala. He says, brilliant, Bridget. He agrees with me that it's a brilliant lecture. Privacy concerns have become a real challenge, in particular with rare diseases, as patients could potentially be identified based on very limited patient health information. Can you share your experience with this, with rare diseases, and how we get over those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Dr. Rogala, and thank you very much for addressing that. This comes down to also is how are you going to collect your data? So, if you're using the case report form, which we'll be using, for example, for Interact, we just have to make sure that the amount of data that's collected that could potentially identify a patient is limited. Because as you probably know, in Europe, in Germany, for example, it's not allowed to collect concurrently on the case report form the complete date of birth, let alone that combined with initials. So we'll have to make sure that in the jurisdictions where we're going is that the data is collected that is allowed by that jurisdiction. And that we can, with the case report form, we can limit it that, for example, in the US, it's allowed to collect the complete date of birth. whereas in Europe it won't be. So we'll just have to make sure that in the different jurisdictions, that the case report form is adapted, that it just collects the data that's allowed in that jurisdiction to prevent the access to any form of PHI, which could divulge the identification of the patient that's included. So it really comes down to defining what data, well, knowing, and again, knowing what is allowed. And then once that is done then, or at least once that is known, then to adapt the case report form accordingly.
I think this is really important. I mean, we're still in the planning stage, the executive stage, we're still pushing the data form around, and we're trying to keep it to a minimum because, as Bridget says, 65% of the information is never used. But for instance, for identification of a patient, they're going to be de-identified, but instead of having date of birth, we're just going to put age at the time of inclusion into the study. Yeah. And try to get around that to be inclusive of every place in the world to do it. That's undermining one of the problems. Dr. Terry Al is asking, she said, a fantastic talk. What plans would there be for collecting blood and tissue for a centralized repository within this network? So I can answer that question. We've spoken about this, and some databases, some registries have huge amounts of data in there, gigantic amounts of data, in as close as putting operative notes onto the registry, so that we can go back and look at the operative notes, individual echoes and the reports, individual x-rays and that sort of data on there. We're not at this time going to do that. We are going to identify those individual locations and patients who have tissue for banking, because not everybody will, and let them store that information at their own site and use the registry to be able to identify at that time when we do studies related to tissue banking, to identify the centers that have the tissue banking. And for instance, those people would do a sub-study about the sort of thing, but the actual repository within the registry is not going to happen. It's going to be a little bit hard to have tissue samples sent to a central repository, but each place that currently does them and in the future will do them, will keep them at their own site, but we will have identification of those individuals on the registry so that we can identify them, and then those people can go and do their subsequent studies. So it's a really important question to have. Tissue banking for cardiac tumors is extremely important, as I showed you on the few slides about histology and subsequent immunohistochemistry and FISH studies and whatever is going to come out in the future. So it's really, really important, but not every hospital collects that sort of information, and so it won't be pertinent to many places, but it's very pertinent in the overall scheme of things and for future studies. So that's what we're going to do at this time.